Hi y'all, welcome to chapter 12. It's about creating graphics. You have to bear with me here, my throat's about to give out. So if I break down in between slides, I apologize. In creating graphics, which you'll have to do for your final report, there are many elements to keep in mind. First of all, don't create a graphic unless it serves a particular purpose for the overall presentation of your report. I know that you have to create some and include them for your grade, but keep in mind that the graphics should help with the report. It shouldn't just be reiteration of the exact same stuff. Make sure that your graphic is simple and uncluttered. I chose this particular graphic as an example because to me there's a little bit too much going on. The background, while adds some, I guess, excitement to the graphic, it's not really necessary. It kind of takes away from the actual information that's being presented. You also have these two pie charts. You have text written all over the place, and it's hard to kind of focus on what's important in this graphic. Make sure that you're only tackling a manageable amount of information with your one graphic. You might have to create more graphics in order to make sure that each one tackles only a small amount of information. Make sure that you meet the reader's format expectations. In presenting numerical information, it's most likely that you use some kind of pie chart or bar graph. Make it so that it's what they would expect to find in that kind of presentation. And finally, make sure that you label all of the information. You need to have a clear title. You need to label each section. You'll probably have some kind of chart on the side explaining what the colors mean, etc. In planning your graphic, keep in mind your audience. You need to make sure that they know what they're looking for and that they understand the graphic. This particular chart to me is really visually pleasing, but I don't really know what it means. I don't really know what the colors mean, the different rings of the circle, etc. So keep in mind what your audience might already know or needs to know in order to understand the graphic. Make sure that your graphic meets the purpose. So pick something that will help you do that. In choosing your graphics, you can first decide what kind of graphic to use based on what you would like to present. If you're presenting some kind of numerical information, you'll probably use a bar graph, a pie chart. If you're creating some kind of logical relationship between different particular properties or organizations, you might use a diagram. If you would like to illustrate instructions or processes, which most likely you probably won't be doing for this assignment, but you would use some kind of flow chart or a table. And finally, visual or spatial characteristics. You could use a map, a photograph, etc. This might be extremely helpful for some of you that are looking at building or some kind of trails in Anchorage. You could take an actual map of that section and use that and add something to the graphic. When using color in your charts, it's important to have contrast, but also to make your chart visually pleasing. Let's look at these two examples, just paying attention to color. The first thing I noticed with this one is the many different tones of red. First of all, they kind of match the background. They're not separated enough. This 28% and 17% to me and the 10% all look really, really similar. And you can also see that here with the side, that architecture and the business almost run into the background. Here, on the other hand, we have these two greens. While I think they're very similar, I think the color here is chosen perfectly. These greens represent the plant, the red for animal food, and the yellow for processed food. So I think that those colors were chosen for a specific reason, and for that, they work really well. We have kind of a huge contrast here with the red and the yellow, which also helps with this graphic. And while yellow is being used here, because it's on the white background, I think that it stands out enough, especially with these other green and red and the purple as the core text. Here again, we see that this 28% kind of runs in with the 17% in the background. And I feel like perhaps I could make this a little bit better, even just by having a shaded background for this pie chart, so that these colors, if they want to use these colors, would stand out a little bit more. In creating your graphics, you have a couple choices. You can use an existing graphic that you find online or through your research. You can modify an existing graphic. For example, if you did want to use a map of bike trails in Anchorage or something like that, you could use an existing graph or picture of Anchorage, and you could even add more to that, showing what you were proposing for your project. And finally, you have to, for this assignment, create some of your own graphics. And for that, I would definitely use the help of the textbook in deciding what kind of graphic to use. I had to include this graphic, and I apologize if it's not quite your time period or if you don't get the joke, but I think it's probably the funniest pie chart I've ever seen. When you want to include those graphics, you have two choices. You can either choose to put the graphic actually in text of your report, or you can choose to put it at the end of your report with all the appendices. Now, this depends on what you'd like to achieve. Sometimes it's really nice to have that graphic in text when you're referring to it. But again, if you have a ton of graphics or a really large graphic, it would be best to probably put it at the end. Make sure to label all your graphics. Don't just shove them in your report. You'll need to introduce them if they are in text, why they're important, what they are, and then put it in your text. Underneath the graphic, and I'll get to this in the next slide, you'll need to explain what the purpose is of that particular chart or graphic. Make it visible, make it stand out from the rest of the text. And finally, make it accessible. If it is in the back of your report, you need to tell people where it is and make sure it's clearly labeled so that they can get to it. If you're labeling your graph, you need to, first of all, like I said before, either have it in text or in the end of the report. If it's a chart or a graph, it needs to be labeled as figure 1, figure 2, etc. If it's a table, it will be labeled table 1, table 2. Labeling your graph in text. Underneath the actual graph, let's say you have a pie chart, underneath in Arabic numbers, all the way flush left, in italics, you will label the figure. For example, figure 1, period, and that would be in italics over on the left side. After you write that part, then you would put a caption explaining what the figure actually represents. So you would have figure 1, period, in italics, and then this explanation would not be in italics. If this is a chart or graphic you've taken from somewhere else, you'll need to include the source information in text, as well as in your final reference page. If it is a graphic that you did not create, here is the basic APA guidelines for citing a graph. You include the author, the date in which it was created, the title of the graph, chart or figure, where you found it, the place of publication, and the publisher. This will be a little bit different if you're finding that graphic online, and you can look up the APA guidelines for that. Here's an example of how you would include images in your reference page. These are the references for this presentation. All right, good luck with your graphic representations. Let me know if you have any questions.